Hello and welcome to Wrestling and Everything, Coast to Coast, with your host, Buddy Sotelo Esquire, Evan Ginsberg, Dr. Mike Leno. And would you like to introduce our guest tonight, Dr. Mike?
I would. Very briefly, I want to say a happy birthday to the one and only Terry Funk, who's in all of our halls of fame and in our hearts. Also, Big Time Memories is doing like 2 or 3 parts on Dick the Bruiser and his WWA Fantastic Territory in Indianapolis and Detroit. Also want to send a shout out to Javier Wiest, who is one of the best writers out there, as is our guest. And we were talking about Vince McMahon very briefly. He's in all of the tabloids this week, the American tabloids. I don't know if Canada has to get our schlunky National Enquirer, our National Examiner, Star, and Globe, all published by the same sleazoid outfit I've worked for in the past out of Delray, Florida, and Boca Raton, Florida. But anyway, Jonathan Schwartz from Slam Wrestling, well known in the our internet wrestling community and the regular wrestling community, is a lawyer and a public policy analyst. Tell us a little about that, because you, one of your main specialties is in human rights, and we could certainly use that at times in pro wrestling.
So first off, thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here. Long-time listener, first-time caller, as they say. In terms of what I do, so I currently work in public policy for the Ontario government. I've been in this role for about 10 years. Before that, I used to work on the advocacy side. So I work for non-governmental organizations, basically for equity-seeking groups on any number of different points of advocacy. So I'm a lawyer by training. I've basically worked everywhere, half gun, well traveled, as they say, and it's brought me here. And also what's brought me here is I am absolutely a lifelong wrestling fan, and a little while ago I just figured, why shouldn't I turn some of my interest in my talent in writing to this as well?
Excellent. Before I throw it to Evan and Russ, Toronto is one of those wrestling cities that reminds me in a way of Japan, or Montreal and Toronto, way into their history, and they are steadfast in not allowing anybody to rewrite, wrestling history, and that's why I so appreciate Toronto. On my honeymoon, we started in Toronto, went to Maple Leaf Gardens, of course, because I hadn't been there since '74. I've only been there once. Got to shoot a main event when Sheik was booking, and the office was Tunney called the office Canadian Big Time Wrestling. Heel, Sheik against Killer Kowalski, and underneath was Igor and Abdullah the Butcher. And the guy whose fan club I ran early 70s on, the Tolis Brothers fan club, Chris Tolis, such a great chef and bon vivant and all of that. And he was like in the undercard, which was difficult for me to see, but a wonderful wrestling town. Ev, let me throw it to you, because Jonathan hits a lot of bases with us, and we're big on human rights and supporting everybody, encouraging everybody to live their best life without online bullying and all that horrific stuff. So Ev, I'll shut up now.
Well, since it's fresh on everybody's mind, I was watching Money in the Bank yesterday, and my thoughts were that here's a billion-dollar corporation that has matches where its wrestlers fall off of, onto, through large ladders, which is not good for the human body. Any other corporation would not want you to fall off of a large 15-foot ladder. Now, some of the wrestlers said to me, quote, the boys want to fall off of these ladders, and they actually request it. But my question, and not to do a monologue, but my question would be, okay, so you have 8 males and 6 or 7 females in ladder matches yesterday. What if 1 or 2 of them said, I don't want a chance wrecking my body falling off of a large ladder? What if their, push or whatnot, was
Let's do something safe, like a dog collar match.
I think 40 years ago, that was the Powers of Pain versus the Road Warriors in the Chi-Town scaffold match, and they decamped to WWF.
Right.
But my question would be, what if a wrestler just says, I don't want to do that? I want to maintain, my bone structure. I want to stay healthy. I don't want to fall off a large ladder. What legal rights do they have to quote, just say no or whatnot?
Well, just to make really clear, first off, I'm not practicing currently, so I'll step a little bit back of offering a concrete legal opinion. I also work in Canada, so our systems are more than a little bit different, especially when it comes to things like workplace law, that kind of thing.
What if they don't want to fall off a ladder in Canada? No, I'm joking.
Well, they just wouldn't be booked in the match. I would think would be the obvious.
Yeah, and frankly, the ladder match started in Stampede Wrestling, so I don't know how far they get with that.
Right.
But I think it's one of the interesting things about wrestling in general that a lot of the rules that seem to apply to other forms of entertainment don't necessarily apply as readily. I think you can argue whether it's the whole fact that wrestlers seem to be classified as independent contractors and the rights that they have in that kind of environment there. I think you can bring up things like how readily or feasible it is that eventually wrestling, especially at that level, the WWEs, the AEWs of the world, could turn into unionized environments as things do get more corporate. Right now, it does seem like, the boss makes the request and it's up to the individual performer to decide whether or not they want to participate in the match. But it does seem like if a wrestler decides not to participate in a match, that's going to dictate how they're going to be used going forward.
Right. They might be afraid. Their push might be de-pushed or diminished, something like that.
And not to kind of go to a dark place, especially not this early in our conversation, but I mean, you can go all the way back to 1999 and the harness stunt that ultimately, unfortunately, took Owen Hart's life. He made it very clear going into that he wasn't necessarily comfortable with it, even though it was demonstrated to him. And unfortunately, at least the record is a really terrible accident happened, but he didn't feel at the time that he had the ability to refuse to go ahead with it.
Now, speaking as lawyer to lawyer, since I also am a lawyer here in California, we have AB 152 that has been passed, which basically takes independent contractors and makes them employees for the most part in a lot of ways. And I'm wondering, how that is going to affect Vince McMahon and wrestling's plans to continually, let's face it, in America, we had both situations where wrestlers were considered part-time independent contractors, yet in Florida, they were considered essential enough employees that they had to still work while everybody else was trying to be locked down for COVID. So, there's wrestling is almost as bad as baseball's trust exemption, which is now going to also be called into question. So I wonder if wrestlers are going to be forever classified as independent contractors. Maybe it's time that had to change.
I tend to think sooner or later it will. I think that, especially in an environment where the term independent contractor is used, but where, at least in WWE's case, they exercise so much control over what other activities a wrestler can be involved in, thinking in terms of recent Zelina Vega, for example, getting released over the fact that she wanted to maintain an independent, I think it was a Twitch stream.
Correct.
And that other wrestlers have tried to kind of maintain these kind of secondary streams of income and secondary media presences. And depending on who it is, which I think is the other issue, that within WWE, there do seem to be separate sets of rules for different talent depending on where they are within the hierarchy. one just coming
up
with
let's not talk about the wellness policy. Let's not even bring up the way the wellness policy is enforced.
I was waiting for somebody to bring up the Randy Orton situation with the 3-strike rule. But if we're talking about just who gets to do what and on whose time, if you're in an organization that effectively prevents you from working for yourself in other contexts, or working for multiple employers, depending on what the type of the agreement is, I have trouble seeing that as something really sustainable. I also think, if I remember correctly, that during the run-up to the last presidential election, there was actually one candidate, I think Andrew Yang, thank you, who at one point kind of took it on himself to argue that pro wrestlers should be considered employees, and wanted to kind of look into that. I know subsequent to that, he wound up running for mayor of New York, and I don't know if anything's actually happened further with that. But every so often, it does seem to attract a certain level of political or mainstream media attention. And I tend to think that as WWE continues to corporatize, sooner or later, it's going to catch up with them. There's going to be some kind of tipping point, and whether it's the independent contractor issue or the union issue, I do think that we're looking at some point at some kind of change within labor practices within that company, and whoever else is standing and big enough that this becomes an issue on their radar.
I want to ask something, but Ev, what happened? Andrew Yang dropped out of the race, didn't he?
He lost. He lost.
He lost the female governor that you have now, but now she's almost completed is it Cuomo's term, and so now she has to run.
Yeah, so she's running again.
Yeah, she just got in, but Yang is not running now at this point, which is a shame. We were hoping, Jonathan, that Biden would have appointed him the way he did, some of the other folks that ran against him in the Democratic side. And it would have been cool if Andrew Yang had been, or interesting, maybe cool's not the right word, had been put into some position where he could actually, continue that, because he's a lifelong wrestling fan. But and I think he's friends with some WWE folks on the roster, et cetera, and felt very passionate about that. And it's Cameo too that Zelina Vega.
Thank you.
That was the other thing. And a lot of those wrestlers were looking and hoping that she would have won out on that. And I don't know what happened when they brought her back. Did they, do you know, any of you guys know, did they allow her to do her cameo, or any of the other worker, quote unquote, independent contractors who were employees?
No idea.
I don't think, I think they're still disallowed from doing that without express permission. So how does Canada, I really love, I've got some great Owen Hart stories. I was very close to him. And I'll just throw this in before I ask the question, because I know Ev is sick of hearing about it. But in '95, I was hired by the Harts to come up and film. It was Stu's 80th birthday party. So that was a private event, tons of wrestlers there. But he had a public event for his audience, which was a Stampede reunion at the Corral venue, one of the biggest there. And Owen and his best mate in WWE, Louis Spicolli, picked me up in it wasn't a blizzard, but it was kind of close to it. Snow everywhere. It was quite a few degrees below zero. And they picked myself and Mike Rogers, he's like the king of Pacific Northwest Portland wrestling results in history. And Mike needed a lift. I go, well, guess who's going to be picking us up? It's my old pal, Owen Hart. I didn't know Louis was going to be in the car, but Owen, true to form, he could drive like a bat out of hell in a snowstorm, and while cursing, using every word imaginable, because we couldn't even see like more than a foot, but he knew those roads and how to navigate that, and was so amazing. Another thing, Evan's tired of hearing me say in putting Owen over, but I was with him whenever that's the late promoter, Kirk White. He's deceased Christmas Day last year, but he was taking advantage of Owen. He brought in Owen for the very first time, and he was telling the world he was Brett's personal appearance manager, which wasn't quite true. That was Marcy Engelstein, the bigwig. Kirk just did it, say, for Northern California, but tried to pass himself off doing more than that. But he has Owen in for an autograph signing at a card store they had part interest in. And Owen was scheduled to sign for all of the fans and then do 50 8x10s, autograph them for Kirk to sell at his store once Owen went back to Calgary. But he signs the 50 when the thing is over. I'm going to take him to the airport before taking him to visit his aunt and uncle, who live near me in one of the nicest areas, the Piedmont district of Oakland. That's where Helen's sister, who was their aunt, and I'd driven Brett there too. But so Kirk says, well, I know you were only committed to do 50. Can you do like 75 more? And Owen just lit into him. I was so proud of him. He said, no, you're going to be devaluing my signature by having me do all these extras that you're not paying me for. He refused to do it. He did the 50 he was signed, committed, and paid to do, and said, Mike, take me to my aunt's, blah, blah, blah. I can't remember her name. But they had a beautiful house up there, up in the hills, wonderful hills of Oakland. So Canada, are there, I'm not asking you to speak legally, but, Anthem for a while was based out of, I forget which province, but are independent contractor versus employee rules, are they different in Canada? Or are they, hopefully, I'm hoping, because I love Canada, are they more stringent on not allowing employers of big corps to get away with terming their employees independent contractors as opposed to what they actually are? Because you can't allow, they're not allowed to take, say it's a talent that's not on TV. They can't take indie shots and work, for indies in the U.S. or Canada whenever they want to. No, that's disallowed. It's one of many things disallowed, at least to my understanding of WWE. So are things different up there, or is it similar?
So that would be a pretty specific area of law that I, frankly, unfortunately to this point, really haven't dealt with. What I will say, though, is, at least in my experience, there's a much greater lean towards regulation within Canada and and from province to province than there seems to be within the U.S. There's always going to be that kind of push-pull, but we do have a stronger kind of regulatory culture, and there's more of a sense for businesses of a need to kind of work within the bounds that are set by government.
And I would think
then seems to be in the place there. So we do have pretty comprehensive employment legislation, at least in Ontario. There's an Employment Act, there's an Employment Standards Act, which kind of set out the rules for the game. And I, again, just kind of spitballing, I'm certainly not aware of a case like you have with WWE in the US. One thing that I kind of note across my column is that there's an awful lot of behavior that you see with WWE particularly, and I think with wrestling in general, that seems to be based on some kind of exceptionalism. It just kind of plays by different rules than most other forms of entertainment or sports, for that matter. So, for example, I know Evan and I have gone back and forth online a couple of times. One thing that I've never really understood within WWE is how the talent is not currently unionized. They're on TV every week. If you look at what the requirements are to get a SAG card, they're minimal. You basically, if I understand correctly, you either, if it's a non-speaking part, even you show up on set for 3 days, you pay your $3,000 and you effectively have a membership, subject to whatever the renewal requirements are. If you have a speaking role, it's even less onerous. So if you think about it, an awful lot of WWE talent should really already qualify, unless there's some kind of exceptionalism that's going on, which is totally possible. Again, it's outside the bounds of my knowledge. But I've always wondered why it's not more widespread, because that would give some of the protections that we've been talking about so far.
And I'm going to throw to Ev, but maybe Ev and Russ know this. With SAG, you also have to have a certain number of on-camera hours, but that's not under WWE's purview. It's, Screen Actors Guild itself and some of the other Producers Guild, whatever you want to potentially belong to. But SAG is the biggie, and these are TV stars, and they're on there. I was just hoping, I think I don't know if you guys, well, I know Evan does. I don't know about Russ or Jonathan. Let's see, John Oliver and Bill Maher have both said something to the effect of Canada looks at a lot of policy that goes on in the U.S., particularly the prior president, and wisely just does the opposite. Does the ethical thing. It does the opposite because not just Canada, but other neighbors of ours and other parts around the world, they go, okay, the U.S. is doing this, let's do the right thing and do the exact opposite. Sort of the George Costanza, where everybody was doing the opposite of what he was suggesting. Ev, let me throw to you. Do you know, because Evan's been the producer in all kinds of documentaries and the Rustler movie with Mickey Rourke, about SAG stuff?
I don't know all the nuances, no. And it's a gray area because WWE is a quasi sport, and it's.
But what about AEW? Because if you guys have heard Britt Baker, and Jonathan, you might have heard her interview. I forget if it was with Fightful, but I don't know if Tony Khan recognizes them more like the employees that they are. That's a completely different atmosphere and environment. And everybody, with few exceptions, like Big Swole, just love the way they're treated. It truly feels like a family. There's none of the politics. Everybody's working. Nobody's ever told not to show up the main event. Everybody, from what it sounds like, is encouraged to do their absolute best work. And that's why, for me, I don't know about you, Jonathan, but it's like can't miss TV because like everything is good. I'm not used to that. I often either tape, we talk about how we time budget wrestling with stuff every single day, at least here in the US, not including NWA Power, MLW, New Japan World, or the streamers, even the Peacock streamer for WWE. But AEW is just killing it. I never fast forward through. I watch it in real time. I'll even eat the commercials to, I don't want to miss a second of it. Whereas a lot of the time, when Flair was still with WWE, I would normally fast forward through all this stuff. I could be done with a 3-hour Raw or 2-hour Raw before it became 3, just to hit whatever Flair was doing and maybe whatever the good stuff was in 35, 40 minutes tops. And I still do that. AEW, no. Rampage, Dynamite, I watch them. Even NXT, which I still love, even though it's a shell of its former self. And that's on Tuesdays, by the way. That's actually one of WWE's best shows they've had. The pay-per-view I watched, I enjoyed it immensely. Congrats to Liv Morgan, who deserves it. I don't know if she's going to be a very short transitional until, the one, I guess she had a concussion.
Rhea Ripley?
Yeah, that's the rumor. We don't know what's going on, but she was just a placeholder, really. One of the placeholders, a la Carmella for Bianca Belair.
Hey, Jonathan, I wanted to ask you a little bit about your own background. First of all, how you got started in wrestling, and then how you got involved in Slam.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's go on to the Slam. All right.
So, in terms of my, actually, I'll if it's okay, I'll just answer Dr. Mike first.
Okay.
Okay. No, just because I'm also a huge AEW fan. I still do watch WWE, and I still do really enjoy even the silly stuff. I think part of the reason that I am a fan and have been and still am is that I don't really make a distinction always between high art and low art. I mean, sometimes you want to watch The Godfather, sometimes you want to watch The Three Stooges. I think that there's got to be a place for both. And sometimes the glory of wrestling is that you have the ability to just kind of turn your brain off and watch people in their underwear pretend to hate each other. And that at a really basic level is part of the fun of it. In terms of things that I really like about AEW, one thing that recently came out is that they released their employee manual, and it has things like mental health and wellness and concussion protocols, and they're being transparent about it in a way that you would really hope that high-functioning corporation with a sense of responsibility for the people who work for it in 2022 are doing. I think part of that is, the Khans also own the Jacksonville Jaguars. And they're dealing with a very high-level, multi-million-dollar enterprise, which is accountable to fans and municipal governments and state government and pretty much all of America. And one thing that I found really interesting, and I think it's something, who knows what AEW is going to do in the future, but one part that I was really watching when they first started was Tony Khan and at the time Cody Rhodes were asked directly, is this going to be a union shop? And Cody was adamant that it would not. And I've always thought that was kind of a miss, because if there was going to be a corporation that could marry more kind of more of that thinking into a pro wrestling environment, and part of Cody's response at the time was that, traditionally wrestling was a non-unionized environment, and that's how it's always worked, and that's how it's going to continue to work in this context. And one of the things that I often think about as a fan is, I love pro wrestling. I wouldn't be writing about it. I wouldn't be talking with you guys if I didn't. But I don't love it when people get hurt for real. And I don't love it when you see guys like Superstar Graham, who are in desperate shape physically and resorting to GoFundMes periodically in order to help pay off their medical bills. And I would hope that there's something out there, and it could be unionization, it could be through better regulation, it could be through all kinds of different ways of doing it, where the people who benefit the corporation and the fans and make us fans ultimately are better taken care of as they get older.
Let me just say something, and we'll go right to Russ's thing, because we do want to talk about.
Sorry, I didn't mean to go off on a rant.
But I had a letter either in '83 or early '84, earliest year of the Observer, talking about the need for medical for the boys, and obviously we all knew they were independent contractors even then. Still unfair, but the need for kiosks, retirement, maybe courses or something. It was a very long letter. How to transition out of wrestling, because we've seen so many guys end up poor. Jonathan, you were, and Russ knows this, Pepper Gomez and his wife Bonnie lived not even a mile from me on Santa Clara Street in Alameda. And Jonathan really has a love and wants to learn more about some of these great stars. Many of them that he mentioned, of course, wrestled in Canada, like Buddy Rogers, Killer Kowalski, his time in Montreal, and even at Maple Leaf. But he was part of the huge Vachon Grand Prix versus Rougeau La Lutte international promotion war there from like 72 to 74, which it's like everybody in the world was coming to Montreal. It was just a huge territory war, even greater, I think, than Sheik versus Bruiser in Detroit, or Annie Gunkel in Atlanta versus the whole NWA with Bill Watts leading the booking team. But anyway, let's get to the Slam question now, because being an old fart, I forgot what my train of thought was on that. Anyway, so
Russ, I was interested in finding out how you got started in wrestling and how that tied into what you do with Slam and what your role is at Slam.
So as I've mentioned, I've been a fan my whole life. I grew up watching it alongside my dad. He took me to my first card. I think it was for like my 6th or 7th birthday out to a card in Oshawa. The main event was Nikolai Volkov versus Randy Savage when he was new. I've been to Maple Leaf Gardens a bunch of times when WWF would come through there. It's generational, and I'm happy and in a way proud that I'm passing it on to my kids who are also big fans. And it's fun kind of watching it now as an adult, watching it through their eyes.
How old are your kids?
So my son's 8 and my daughter is 6. And my daughter's as big a fan as my son. And I will say one thing that wrestling is actually starting to get right is representation for women as well as men. My daughter is thrilled anytime she sees, quote unquote, the girl wrestlers come on and do their thing. And it's great to see. Not that I'm anticipating any of my kids are going to main event WrestleMania, but the fact that they get to join into this hobby that I've really loved forever, I think is awesome. I think one of the most rewarding things in that is it gave me a completely new appreciation for John Cena. I grew up during Hulkamania. I was in undergrad and high school and undergrad during the Attitude Era. John Cena comes on and he's basically a throwback to that kind of Hulk Hogan superhero kind of character, and I kind of fall off. But then I see how my son responds to him and how colorful he is, and the fact that he is a living superhero. And it's great because it draws him in. And to speak to the column, one of the first things that I wrote, I had read something actually on another website, which was basically somebody trashing WWE and hoping that they went out of business because here was AEW all brand spanking shiny and new. And to my way of thinking, no, you want both. You want as big of an audience out there. You want as many different kinds of entertainment and as many different kinds of wrestling out there, whether it's for purists like myself or people who like the, more flashy stuff or the cartoony stuff or the silly, allegedly funny stuff. And I know we all have different takes on what counts as funny or not. But build the biggest tent possible, get as many eyes on the product as possible, and it only grows. And the same way as I was a Hulkamaniac when I was 6, and really a lot less of a Hulkamaniac for a whole bunch of different reasons now, it gets people in and they grow into the hobby. And I felt compelled to kind of start writing about that. And, for being on Facebook, one of the first things that I wrote was actually in response to an offhand comment that Evan had made on Facebook, where he was talking about art versus commerce and the decision. I think it was at the time, it was Adam Cole and Kyle O'Reilly going to AEW versus Sami Zayn and Kevin Owens contracts coming up and them sticking with WWE. And basically, one could argue taking the money and running. And you can see, Sami Zayn and Kevin Owens, for the spots that they're in WWE, they're the guys who are charged with safely working with the celebrities, like Logan Paul or like Johnny Knoxville. They're the guys who were teamed up against Daniel Bryan and Shane McMahon when they were first coming back.
They're the guys doing bad comedy.
Yeah. And we're all... You're familiar with their work in ROH. I'm familiar with their work on the Quebec and Ontario independent scene going back even before that. Watching Kevin Steen basically almost cause a riot in a small banquet hall in Mississauga, Ontario, which is a suburb here, just getting on the mic and talking trash. And then going out and beating the living heck out of his opponent. I can't even remember who his opponent was. And El Generico coming in heroically and saving the day and brain busting everybody within a 10-mile radius. So on the one hand, yes, is it as artistically satisfying as what I might like to see them do in AEW? No, but they'll get paid and it gives them the opportunity to go home, raise their families privately, and get out more on their terms, one might think. Whether that actually happens or not, who knows? And I think that's... I've always found that that's kind of an interesting point within wrestling, that there's this kind of intersection between the art of it, and I'm a huge Bret the Hitman Hart fan, so I'm used to him saying pro wrestling is an art, and he's dedicated to that art form, and he's put on brilliant performances, and he's worked with guys like Ted DiBiase and Kurt Hennig, and all of these, even Flair, with whom he didn't necessarily got along, but still made pretty good matches with. And, looking at it from that standpoint, but I've read enough autobiographies, and I've heard enough that the conversations that the wrestlers always have are who drew the biggest house, who's making the most money. So it's always this kind of really interesting and not far under the surface, if it's accessible to a guy who's just a fan like me, that kind of tension. And I find that really interesting.
I want to bring you up because you had that bond with your father in wrestling. But I just want to say this quickly. Sammy and Kevin who Evan and I saw, years before they ever went. Evan with Ring of Honor. I also saw him in Ring of Honor, but Kevin in particular at Pro Wrestling Guerrilla in LA was brilliant early on, his first or second year in his career, taking a mic and he'd be working with somebody like Danielson or Samoa Joe, but he'd be doing all this commentary about it to the fans, talking to the fans. He's brilliant then, before anyone had really heard of him. So Evan had that bond with his father. Ev, you've written books on it, and Jonathan had touched on that. We've all, hopefully Russ had a relationship with somebody else in his family. No, but your brother, I went with my grandfather who got to watch Gorgeous George and Rogers and Rocca. We'll talk about that offline. But Ev, you had a great wrestling bond with your father, which is really heartening and great to hear.
Well, absolutely. But I just wanted to get back to what Jonathan was saying and play devil's advocate. Cesaro going to AEW, he's going to create art. He's going to have a push. He's going to live up to his potential. He's not going to do bad comedy. And if he makes 10%, 20%, 30% less than Zayn and or Kevin Owens, I'm always going to go with create art. We made the wrestler. WWE is going to make, the Marine 17. It's a choice. It's a choice. And I just have more respect for people that, create art. Not to be repetitive, but
they do within the confines of what they're allowed to do with WWE. Like you look at The Miz, and he's a great heel, but he's under those parental constraints. He can't curse or do the things MJF was doing, but he does a great job of it. So,
but the Miz in 15 years has had less great matches than a former NWA champion, a Flair, Race, Terry Funk, Dory Funk, Jack Briscoe had in a month. Let's be honest.
Yeah, but it's not in the league.
Sorry, can I throw something out there?
No, you can't. Of course
you can.
Of course you can. Yeah.
Because I hear that criticism a lot, and I don't disagree with it. But what I always come back with is it's to get to a point where Terry Funk was Terry Funk. And I think Terry Funk is all-time great. He's one of those guys where his work is evergreen. You could put him in any era and he would find a way to be brilliant. And I don't think there's that many people who are like that. I think you could argue that about Flair. Nick Bockwinkel, I think, is definitely up there and vastly underappreciated. So I think generational talents. But I also, Ted DiBiase, a few others, I think that for people like that, until they become Terry or Dory Funk or Nick Bockwinkel or Ric Flair or whoever, they spend an awful lot of time on an awful lot of small circuits working 4, 5, 6 shows a night before Ric Flair is bleach blonde, big rope, peroxide, post-plane crash Ric Flair, who's the Ric Flair we all know and love. He had to go through training in the barn with Vern Gagne. He had to go through the part where he was, close to 300 pounds rambling Ricky Rhodes.
He was heavy set jobber for Vern for a good 2 years before he got sent to Crockett's Mid-Atlantic.
And he worked frequently and constantly during that point until he discovered who Ric Flair was and how to turn that into a character that captivated people the way that he has. I would argue, especially since the 1980s and WWE consuming the territories and going on through the AWA failing and WCW and all the rest of it, there haven't been the opportunities for wrestlers to get those reps in to figure out who they are away from the spotlight, so that by the time the pipeline from college or the NFL to 6 months in NXT to the main roster, I think it's a very different comparison. If you had given Miz the length of time that Dory Funk had working in Amarillo outside of the public eye. Is he going to be Dory Funk? No. But I think from an in-ring perspective, you would see a very different product than you'll ever get now that he's focused on his reality show career and doing pretty well at that.
The truth is always somewhere in the middle, and I'm not disagreeing with you whatsoever. But what I'm finding in 2022 is that the fans are judging quote unquote greatness with a list of meaningless WWE titles. You know, so-and-so has had 16 titles, 14 titles, 12 titles. You can't remember one defense. You know, it's just a meaningless blur. They're judging it on, you know, the reality show, the hits, the views, the minutia. I've seen guys go, The Miz has an expensive house and a pretty wife. And I go, what's that have to do with his in-ring performance? You know, you're judging greatness on, you know, unrelated things. All I want as a jaded old school fan is to watch a great wrestling match. And when I saw that with Cody Rhodes and Seth Rollins. So it's not a blanket anti-WWE, you know, it's just calling it as I see it. And every time I see The Miz and others, it's a 2.5 to 3.5 star match. The guy's doing his best. This is what he's capable of. But when people go, he's an all-time great heel, I just don't see it. You could say he's a great talker. He's a great promo guy. Absolutely.
Who do you and I say are, well, maybe it's unfair to judge them. It's apples, oranges to today's guys. But who do we always say greatest heels? I think we usually say Sheik and Killer Kowalski. Those are our
Sheik, Kowalski, Buddy Rogers. You know, right, definitely
Piper.
Yeah, Piper.
Absolutely.
Well, I was blessed to see
Terry Funk.
I'm throwing Bockwinkel back into the mix.
Bockwinkel, top 10 for sure. Yeah, I mean, it's all subjective, but please don't, you know, WWE put out a list years ago where, you know, Killer Kowalski is number 50 and The Miz is, you know, 20 or 30 ahead of him.
This is a top
that's
50.
Absurd. It's absurd.
Like the last
I have to admit, I tapped out on that when Shawn Michaels and The Undertaker were like 1 and 2.
Shawn Michaels was great. I mean,
and I like both guys, but I don't think that. I think if you're looking top 5, top 10, I would rank differently.
Okay. But my point
is, it's art. It's subjective.
Let's hear Jonathan's favorites.
My point is, Shawn Michaels delivered great matches night after night after night in the ring. The Miz does not. He does not. Even the Usos. These guys come out every night 3 to 4 stars, but they don't put on great matches. It's not the Midnight Express. It's not the Rock and Roll.
Well, there's also something to say about the quality of opponents too. You know, you're only a lot of times you're only as good as the guy you're in the ring with. And, you know, when you had Harley Race facing Flair or Dusty Rhodes or whatever, you're having greats against the greats. You know, it's hard for Miz or anyone right now to be all that great because their opposition, you know, that's all been lowered. It's not the same talent level as what
the style is a much protected style as opposed to Bruno. I mean, we were blessed to see Ev saw Billy Robinson at Madison Square Garden, and I shot a ton of Billy Robinson and Carl Gotch and all of these, you know, people on my list. I was going to ask Jonathan, if you had to just throw off the top of your head, no criticism because it's all esoteric, subjective, give us some of your favorites, or if they're not favorites, maybe artists in the ring or whatever you want to term it, but some of your favorites.
So.
Besides Brett and you know,
okay, Brett and Owen for that matter would both be way up there. I always like the more kind of technical style. I kind of would go between them and the absolute madmen in the ring. So in terms of favorites in no particular order, the Harts, the Hennigs, Ric Flair, Ted DiBiase, just because he was an absolute masterful heel. very different style, but I thought also a really effective heel, Rick Rude. And he was one guy who, whether you had him playing a slightly different character in WWE or WCW or down in Texas, whether he was doing the more kind of campy side of his personality or the straight up beat up your opponent type, could sell it either way. Was also really good at making his opponents look good. And for being somebody who had, really potent offense, was great in that respect. I think Tully Blanchard is another guy who you don't, well, you see him recently as a manager in ROH and AEW, but I've got to tell you, dollars for dollar, I would put Tully and Arn up against the Midnights any day in terms of my favorite kind of technical heel tag team.
Well, great.
Absolute best tag teams ever. For me, it's Steiner's and, well, Road Warriors #1, Steiner's a close #2, just for the way that they could throw their opponents around. Valiant Brothers. I always like guys like the Samoans, the Sheik, Abdullah the Butcher. If you were going to ask me top 5 promos, I would actually throw the Sheik and Abdullah the Butcher and all those kind of silent guys who would just glare at the camera and make you scared for your life. More effective than guys who could get up in front of a mic and speak for 20 minutes.
What about Nick? I'm talking Bockwinkel, obviously, as a soft heel. He never yelled, or rarely, and got over perhaps more effectively than anybody, and was magnificent. And if you've not seen DiBiase in either Georgia Championship or Mid-South, man, he was aces. And I asked him that question. I asked Dusty that question. DiBiase was supposed to have the bond put on him to become NWA champion. Somehow or other, there was some kind of double cross. I think Eddie Graham backed Dusty, and that's how the first Dusty title reign came about. But like in '79, there was a lot of talk at that NWA meeting about putting it on DiBiase, and it pains me. And I told Ted that he kind of ripped it off and poo-poos it, but we really wanted to see him as champ back in '79.
He was a near miss on a few occasions. He was. I'd heard the stories that at one point he was in contention for the NWA belt. Bob Backlund was, for that matter, as well, and he just wound up going up north. At one point, the storyline around WrestleMania 4, if I understand correctly, was that he was actually going to win Not Savage, and somehow that got turned around. I think it had to do with Savage losing the Intercontinental belt and not getting it back, and this was to kind of make good with him. And DiBiase just got the short end of that stick. If you go back even before that, DiBiase held the North American Championship in the WWF, which became the Intercontinental belt, and yet that's not recognized. So it's funny. He's just kind of one of those characters who's been everywhere, and just it never fell his way.
Oh, and his Japan work for Baba.
Well, he had
his team with Hansen.
Yeah, Hansen.
He had his tag team championship run with IRS in Money Inc.
But you can't talk. You have to talk about Stan Hansen and Ted DiBiase in Japan. Forget him. As good as Mike Rotunda is, and there's no comparison to what DiBiase was doing in Japan in terms of tag work, in my opinion, at least. You got to watch that. If you've not seen DiBiase in Japan, it'll knock your socks off as well as Mid-South and Georgia Championship, where DiBiase was on fire at the time when Kevin Sullivan, Tommy Rich, Ev, you remember all that stuff? I don't know. I'm sure I was not the only guy just sitting on every one of DiBiase's words and activities.
Yes, he was amazing. Face or heel. Guy was good as anybody.
Kevin Sullivan's also a guilty pleasure.
Oh yeah.
His vaguely devil-worshipping gimmick back in Florida was so ahead of its time, and even to this day, he's one of the few guys who I'll just kind of randomly remember promos that he cut. Especially his work with the Grand Wizard when he just kind of roar Sullivan, my son, and talk about Hulk Hogan as the White Bengal Tiger. Just
well, somebody named Mark Lewin Purple Haze because Kevin did smoke a lot of ganja while listening to Jimi Hendrix, and did it at times with King Curtis Ayake, who I knew well. Visited him in Oahu, and obviously Lewin was such there's a guy that people don't talk about, and look at him, Evan. You remember him with Don Curtis, one of the greatest babyface tag teams of all time. Worked for Vince Sr. and his counterpart in Chicago, Fred Kohler. And then look at all the stuff that Lewin with the Sheik in Detroit, and then he was pushing the fact that he was Jewish, which nobody did, very few in wrestling at all. I can't even remember anybody doing that. And Lewin was pushing his religion and his faith against that of the Sheik. And, maybe it was stereotypical and today it wouldn't be viewed PC, but cutting hellacious promos. And then the Florida stuff that Jonathan's talking about, where he doesn't talk at all, and crazy man character, maniac Mark Lewin for Dallas, for Fritz's territory. I think just prior to the really insane stuff in the Florida Championship with Sullivan booking. Just some great memories. We should probably, how long are we going? Because we want Jonathan to plug all of his.
Yeah, we got a few more minutes. I wanted to ask a question I ask everyone from Canada, which is the to me the Canadian conundrum, which is why you guys are like so polite and so nice and so even tempered whenever we have any guests from Canada on, yet some of the fiercest, toughest competitors are Canadian wrestlers. And it's always weird for me to say, and same with hockey players and some of the players we get from on the football teams. What is it that makes Canadians revert from being these polite, very friendly, easygoing people to becoming such vicious competitors in the ring? How can you explain that?
No generalizing there, but
well, I'll say thank you for the polite part. I think Jim Carrey actually explained it well. We're a country of a few million people comparatively, and the biggest economy, the biggest show, the places where if you want to go to really make it, is a much bigger market, and it's flooded with people from all over the world. So if we're going to make it in the United States, we'd better be damn good. And there's an understanding of how hard one has to work in order to succeed there.
Look at Howie Mandel. He's got like 10, 15 jobs when he was hosting that game show that what's her name that married the Prince, Harry, Marco?
Deal or No Deal.
Yeah. Well, she was one of the briefcase holders. Speaking of Money in the Bank, she was one of the briefcase holders on Howie Mandel's show. And now she's not the princess, I guess, since they're living in Santa Barbara. They've sort of excommunicated from the royal family. But that's a tidbit there. A lot of great, fantastic entertainers from. I've had lots of discussions with Greg Oliver on Canadian singers and the value of Rush. That's for another time when hopefully we can drag Jonathan back to talk about Rush's rock legacy, one of the greatest in rock music. But
speaking of Greg Oliver, he put something publicly today. He said that the International Pro Wrestling Hall of Fame should rename the award that was named after Rocky Johnson because he had kids out of wedlock, blah, blah, blah. What's your take on that? That opens up a whole can of worms. What do you think?
Oh, it does. If you haven't read it, it's on si.com and slamwrestling.net. This is where I plug things. I've got to admit that article threw me for a loop. First off, I thought it was really, really well done. I just wound up feeling very much for the now adult kids in the situation. I mean, I can certainly, I'm not going to speak to what Rocky Johnson did. I think that, adults make their choices, and unfortunately, sometimes those have consequences. But, part of being a grown-up is you live with those consequences and you do the right thing. And the one thing that I kind of felt most strongly about coming out of that article is the fact that he chose not to be engaged, even when the kids reached out to him well into adulthood, long after they could have had any reasonable claim for anything against him beyond just trying to get to know the man. And I think that's really unfortunate. And I think that the kids are all living with that legacy. I'm a parent myself. I understand things don't work out. I understand it's not always possible to be the kind of parent one would want to be, but I would hope one would want to be. And one would try to do the best that one can. And certainly what comes out of that article is that, Johnson made different choices. And it seems like Johnson made those kind of choices consistently, whether it was with those kids or with his first family or with the Maivias.
But my question was, Greg Oliver was saying, take Rocky Johnson's name off the award, and believe me, I'm not saying what Rocky did was a great thing, but I go back to Muhammad Ali, who was one of the greatest athletes of all time and a great humanitarian and an ambassador for peace all around the world, who introduced his mistress as his wife at a press conference. And all the reporters were going, that's not his wife, that's his girlfriend. So does doing something that's quote unquote morally, objective, not okay, morally not okay, shall we say, does that negate all the good things? And would you take a name off an award? I mean, that's what Greg wanted today. And
that's the Bill Cosby argument right there.
Bill Cosby, the colleges and everything took away a lot of his honorary degrees, but they sure kept the money donated. So there's always hypocrisy with all of this. But I don't know. I mean, I have mixed emotions about all of it. Would you take Ali's name off of stuff because he was an adulterer? I mean, what about all the good things that he did? I don't know. I'm just throwing it out there. I'm not making any.
Remember, nobody's fully good or bad. There are kind of, many are in the middle. Not everybody.
I'm married 14 years. I never cheated, honestly. So, I mean, I'm not giving my stamp of approval on Rocky's, on the road activities. But do you take a name off of an award? He was still a great wrestler with a great career, and I
absolutely take Greg's argument, and I don't disagree with that. I think that if you're looking to professional wrestling for paragons of virtue, they're going to be very few and far between. I think that we look to these people to provide entertainment and to provide an escape from our daily lives. I'm not necessarily looking for them for moral guidance. And I don't know that that's necessarily a reasonable expectation. I think some of the people we could look to for moral guidance, like presidents, there's a bit of a spotty track record there. So why would we expect something higher from wrestling?
We did not get that with the last one, talking about adultery. Oh my God.
Well, let me make the jump real quick. Okay, so you're giving awards to various wrestlers. What if they did things that were morally questionable? I mean, how far do you take this, or do you just judge it? So and so is a great wrestler. Give them an award. Keep it simple. I don't know.
Well, that's
already been given.
That's the argument. Do you separate the art from the artist?
James Brown beat his wife. You can't take away from the fact he was as great an entertainer that ever stepped foot on a stage. I mean,
nobody wants to bring up Benoit or what he did. He's been erased from all the record books and from all the obelisks in town. You
could still watch Benoit footage 24/7, but you can't.
Nobody wants to talk about him.
Can't excuse what the guy did.
I was very close to Chris Benoit, room with him at Inoki's Keo Plaza Hotel in January '91. Very close to him. Got Christmas cards I've saved to this day. I can show anybody. The last 3 years of his life with WWE, though, that a lot of us were just dropped, and that's, I think, when stuff was really going south in terms of the alleged drugs and everything else. It just stopped cold turkey. And, so, but the Benoit prior to that, there was no greater student of the business. Watched tapes. I remember watching stuff with him, watching Dynamite and Sayama matches from like midnight to 6 in the morning with Chris Benoit and stuff like that. So, but I also knew Nancy, and it's like two phases. The good.
But I think it's a different.
Yeah, it's a totally different.
Somebody murdering their wife and kid, you're not going to name an honorary award after the guy. Somebody.
I haven't read the article, so this is a Rocky Johnson honorary. Is the award named after Rocky, or did he just receive?
Yeah, there's an award named after Rocky Johnson. So Greg Oliver said you should change the name of the award. Make it the Jonathan Schwartz
award,
or
I'll take it.
The Russell Jackman Award or whatnot.
Only if you're going to give it to me.
I have to say, it's so disheartening hearing that whenever we all heard it, because I watched Rocky in San Francisco. He had a match I shot against Dory Funk Jr. in L.A. I shot his only, to my knowledge, NWA title match against Harley at Kiel Auditorium in St. Louis. So nothing but great, and then to hear this stuff. I mean, I knew I didn't know he fathered all these kids out of wedlock, and he's cheating on Ada, who's one of the nicest, sweetest. She reminds me a bit of Georgianne Macropolis in that she connects everybody from fans to the boys to the offices. Ada is literally everywhere. She goes to Cauliflower Alley every year. She's front row at all these WWE pay-per-views. I think she's even been at an AEW show or two. She didn't deserve that. I mean, that's a whole long bollocks argument we could get into. But and Jonathan and I were emailing about Rocky and Ricky Johnson today, whether I still don't know if they're legit brothers, and Jonathan said they were. So
as far as I know, they are.
So why, when a lot of the stuff on Young Rock, there's some stuff that's true down to the letter, and then there's some stuff that's absolutely not true. Liam Ivia did not have Andre or all of those big wrestlers, Flair, Greg Valentine, Piper. They never wrestled for her. So they've taken weird liberties with that show, but there is no nicer person than Adam. Whose ever ambulance is going. Dwayne is a baby at some of these arenas, and so it's disheartening hearing that about Rocky. Although I mean, when I forget when we learned 15 years ago he was cheating and the marriage broke up.
So Jonathan, why don't you tell the fans how they could get a hold of you, how they can find you on social media, how you're connected with the internet, and people can get a hold of you.
So I am best reached through slimewrestling.net. I have the column. It runs every 2 weeks. It's Wrestler's Court with Jonathan Schwartz. Gotta love a good wrestling rhyme. I basically just actually finished my last piece and got it out a bit early Friday because I was calling for Logan Paul to win Money in the Bank, and ultimately the WWE champion. And I will stand by that. I will die on that hill.
There you go. Well, very good.
We're going into 3 years of Roman Reigns. He beats Brock Lesnar. He beats John Cena. He beats everybody they put in front of him. There's got to be a wild card.
Wow. Well, and then what about through social media? How could people get a hold of you?
So I have an email account. It's wrestlerscourt, all one word, .js@gmail.com. Please feel free to send as much hate mail as you like. I read it all, and I actually get a real kick out of it. It's kind of steamrolled into a couple more columns, and I'm happy to speak with everybody.
And do those colors behind you represent anything?
Actually, we just finished Pride Month. To be perfectly honest, this is just the background that pops up automatically with Skype. They change it every month. But I'm certainly proud and happy to stand with everybody and anybody who is seeking equity.
There you go.
That's a great word to end on, and we
let me end on a sad note. I just want to send my condolences to the family and friends of Butcher Blackwell, an indie wrestler from my area. I knew him. He was on my show several times. Good guy. He passed away a week or so ago. Butcher Blackwell, and I like to represent some of the indie guys who do not get acknowledged, and he was one of them. So a good guy, and another guy who's gone too young. He was in his 50s. I don't know the exact age, but everybody in this area that knew him was very saddened. So R.I.P. Butcher Blackwell.
10-bell salute to him, for sure.
Jonathan, the thing I forgot when I had that brain fart was I was talking about wrestlers and writing, even in the early 80s, about needing Keogh's retirements. Pepper Gomez, who lived near me, he had kidney failure, and they were living in a duplex. He and Bonnie had nothing. Here's a guy who wrestled, main evented in Australia, AWA, WWA world champion for Dick the Bruiser, and they had nothing. And so with some of the things you were talking about, they could have benefited, seeing a lot of those older wrestlers like Gorgeous George dying in poverty and of alcoholism. He had nothing. He's invested all this money ahead of his time trying to promote eating turkey burgers in the early 60s. And now, it's a great beef substitute. He was so ahead of his time, died in poverty. And that's what happened to a lot of those folks. Whereas now you look at, or Russ was talking about the Mrs. home, or Evan, Mansion, and it breaks my heart. Some of those guys, even Larry the Axe Hennig was not well off and should have been. The only guy I'm even aware of from our era, my era, Evan's era, was Lou Thez, who wisely, there was X amount of people. Like before we let go, did Killer Kowalski? He wasn't living lavishly. A guy,
Killer Kowalski told me he was ripped off, and guy took his life savings and left the country. He didn't have much, believe me. So Nikolai was in good shape. Nikolai had a farm property. Nikolai saved his money. Lanny Poffo's in good shape.
Randy Savage
Randy Savage certainly saved.
But they're few and far between. Like Lanny moved to, is he living in Uruguay?
He's in Ecuador.
Yeah. Last time we had him on.
Yeah. Yes. Well, anyway, guys, we're out of time for tonight. Really appreciated having you on the show, and we'd like to have you on. Yeah, we'd like to have you on in the near future, especially if you have something special to promote.
I'd love to. Happy 4th of July.
Jonathan,
thank you so much.
I want to bring Jonathan back, drag him back. Combate Kurosai, Domarigato Gozaimashite, merci beaucoup, Jonathan. Thanks for coming. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Good night, everyone.
Merci bien.